those of you that don't know me, I'm the former negotiating committee chairman for FDA. I was summarily dismissed here via a resignation process a couple weeks ago. And I suppose most of you are curious as to how all that came about. And let me just tell you how the process was going and where we were at. On, it would have been about November 16th, we came back, I believe that was on a Tuesday. We came back from an NMB meeting up in Washington, D.C., in which we had a pretty cantankerous session, not only with the company, but also with the members of the NMB. And basically the problem was the company was balking at re-engaging in negotiations. We were open to any and all suggestions, any and all forums that they wanted to conduct it in, and any type of process they wanted to engage in. We wanted to get a deal. But we were not willing to compromise on certain core values that were at issue. And those of you who have read my negotiating updates in the past, you know that there were always 4 threshold issues that we had to achieve acceptable agreement on to get a contract. And those 4 threshold issues were scope, compensation, work rules, which involves 4 different sections of the contract, and on the R&I piece, which involves 2 different sections of the contract. We were not willing to compromise beyond a certain point in those areas to get an agreement. And the company was reluctant to engage past their, what's now called their 1030 agreement, their October 30th. It wasn't an agreement. It was a document that they loaded out to us about 5 o'clock in the evening or in the afternoon on October 30th. We maintained that that document was deficient in so many areas, and for those of you that saw it on the web, you saw that it became a virtual document. It changed on a daily basis, where they filled in holes, they made corrections, and well, I mean, that's not any way to negotiate. You know, when you negotiate, you sit down and you work out the language, you agree conceptually, you work out the language, and you get a handshake on it. And we could never do that on that 1030 document because it was so flawed. When we came back from the NMB, our last words to, my last words to Maggie Jacobson, who was the chairwoman of the NMB, was she kept characterizing our dilemma as an impending train wreck. And I said, well, Maggie, I said, if things do not change, if the company's position is not going to change, I said, let the train wreck begin. And she, of course, was not very thrilled with me. And she, in effect, said that we're not going to let that train wreck happen. Either the NMB was going to attempt to reassert jurisdiction, which would be unprecedented in federal law, or they were going to convene a presidential emergency board, which would have the effect of postponing our efforts, our timeline through peak season into next year. So I came back, we all came back, and then on the, our last charge from Maggie was to come up with a new, complete bottom line proposal, section 1 through section 30, which we were working on. And we were working on it as late as Thursday evening. The infamous meeting that happened on Thursday evening between Ken Masterson, who's the FedEx General Counsel, Frank Fato, and Byron Cobb, occurred supposedly around midnight on Thursday night. And it was at this meeting that apparently the company, through Masterson, said that they were not going to re-engage in negotiations, or were not inclined to re-engage in negotiations as long as I was at the table. And I didn't know anything about this meeting, and up until this point, I'd always been kept pretty well informed about meetings between Frank or Byron or whomever and company officials. They always let me know as to what was happening and what the topic of conversation was going to be and so on. I was not informed of this meeting, and the first I heard about it was on Friday morning, and this would have been October 19th. that right? 20th, I guess it is. Yeah, November 20th. At 9 o'clock in the morning, when Frank came in to brief me on this meeting that he and Byron had with Ken Masterson. And during this briefing, or during this discussion that Frank and I had, it became very evident that he'd made a deal with Masterson that basically involved asking me to step aside. And the reason for that was because Masterson had said that they did not feel like they could produce any kind of a document or any proposal that would meet my needs. And I said, well, Frank, that's just not true, and you know it. I said, we set certain standards as a negotiating committee that we have to meet in the threshold areas. And I said, once we have agreement in the threshold areas, everything else is very fixable. And he said, well, Masterson just thinks you're going to dump on any proposal they put out there. And I said, well, Frank, if that's the problem, if I'm the obstacle, then I'm offering to resign again. And he said, well, I'll take it under consideration. And that was the first time Frank had ever used those words with me, is that he'd take it under consideration. About an hour later, I get a phone call from Maggie Jacobson of the NMB. She's the chairwoman of the NMB, and this is the board that makes the big decisions on when labor groups and managements are having problems. And she, in a very diplomatic way, asked me to step aside and let the process restart. I said, well, Maggie, let the process restart or let there be a train wreck. I said, we're willing to let the process restart. And she, in effect, says, no. She says, you're the problem. She says, the company doesn't want to restart with you at the table. And again, I'm not quoting her directly. What I'm doing is really paraphrasing what she was telling me in very diplomatic terms. And so after my conversation with her, I went to lunch with Byron and Frank, and I discussed with them my conversation with Maggie Jacobson, and then reiterated my offer to resign if they thought that that was really the problem, and that that would help move the process forward. And Byron said, would you be okay with that? And I said, well, sure, Byron. I said, I'm not on an ego trip with this. I'd probably rather go fly airplanes anyway. So the decision was pretty much made that I would be resigning. And initially, Frank wanted me to stay on as chairman, but to do it from Seattle. And I said, well, yeah, maybe that would be okay. But the more I thought about it, I thought, well, I better not allow that to happen, because my name is then going to be attached to a document that I had no control over and no input into as to what the final document looked like. So I nixed that plan and I went ahead and resigned. And since I resigned, and technically I'm an advisor or consultant to the negotiating committee at this time, and since I have resigned, Mike Weiland has been very, very good about calling me virtually every night and briefing me on what's going on at the negotiating table. And the only thing I can say, and I don't want to pretend to speak for Mike because he's not here and he has the first-hand information and so on, but the only thing I can say is that I don't think we did ourselves any good by caving, maybe caving isn't the right word, but Frank and Byron made a business decision. And that business decision was to go down a different road than what we'd been traveling down. And I did not want to go down that road, and they didn't want me to, stand in the way of them going down that road. So right now at negotiations, my understanding is that the company is basically insisting that the cost of the subcontracts, that the cost of their strike preparations be paid for by the pilot group. And what this really means is that ultimately what you will see in the contract is you will see either language or numbers in the compensation areas and so on that are very unfavorable. Now, Mike is, after talking with Mike, I'm convinced that he's not going to let that happen. And the latest discussions that I understand have taken place is that even the company understands that such a document could never float with the crew force, where it was obvious that the work rules and compensation and the R&I all economic issues were in effect had penalty clauses because of our recalcitrance in this whole operation. Well, now my understanding is the discussion is in terms of delayed implementation. And what this does is this saves the company somewhere probably between, depending on what the final document would look like, this saves the company somewhere between $10 and $15 million a month. So the cost of the subcontracts, the cost that the company incurred were, let's say, $75 million. And if you assess an average value of $15 million additional cost to the contract, then a delayed implementation of about 5 months would cover those costs. So if an agreement was reached today, I think you would see something where the company would be suggesting that this contract would be implemented on or about June 1st, something like that. And of course, that's totally unacceptable too, but I'm speaking as an individual, not as a member of the negotiating committee. Where do we go from here, assuming that they cannot reach an agreement anytime soon? I suspect we're going to have to go through our internal gyrations that we've gone through before, new elected representatives, maybe a new committee, and then restart the process again sometime next year. On Sunday, I had lunch with Frank Fato, only because I don't hold any grudges. I don't take any of this stuff personally. Frank and Byron made a business decision, and I want to, remain on good terms with these people. So Frank and I met for lunch, and he was convinced that they could have a deal in the next 8 days or so. And my question to Frank was really twofold. Number one, I said, is this going to be a deal that's acceptable to the crew force? And he just kind of shrugged. He didn't know. He didn't know how the thing would ultimately look. And I said, number two, I said, did it help that I stepped out of the way in terms of what you're seeing at the table from the company? In other words, are they being more amenable? Are we getting there? And he says, yes. He says, it definitely helped that you're out of the way. I said, well, I'm really glad to hear that, because if it didn't help, then it would have been a total waste for me to step aside. So at least according to Frank, progress is being made. I didn't come with a prepared speech or anything, as you can tell, so I'm just going to open it up to questions. There's nothing that's off limits here. You can ask me anything you want. I answer everything to the best of my knowledge. Okay.